Good evening and welcome to the forum. I'm John Mattison. Tonight we're talking about business in South Africa because business is where we have to create the much needed jobs, but from two fresh points of view. My first guest is Phakamisa Ndzamel. Phakamisa is a South African financial journalist who's written for major financial publications here and abroad, and he has explored the history of Black South African business and found a lot that will surprise you. It's in his new book, Native Merchants, The Building of the Black Business Class in South Africa. Phakamisa, welcome.
Thanks, John. Thank you to your viewers and your team for coordinating the interview this evening.
Very glad to have you. I enjoyed this book very much. There's a lot of fresh material in it, although, of course, a lot of the history of obstacles to Black business is very painful.
Correct, John. You know, one of the reasons I wrote this book was to try and close gaps in mainstream publishing and in our basic and higher education curricula. You know, I found it to be a great disappointment that, at university, at school, well, not at preschool, we were never taught about the business participation of Black people in this country. And by Black, I mean Black, African, Indian, and colored. We were never taught about it except as laborers or workers in basic terms. So rather than complaining, I decided I was going to spend time researching and trying to uncover these people. Of course, I must say the story was conceived at Business Day. One of my page one editors, Patrick Balger, had asked me to use my financial writing skills to record a modern biography of a Black businessman or a woman post-1994. So I went around trying to critique the whole notion of Black economic empowerment and as a business framework. And as I spoke to people, which I've mentioned in the book, I decided, we could not talk about Black economic empowerment without understanding the reasons behind Black economic empowerment. And that took me back to the 1800s, or call it the late 19th century, and the early 20th century. And that's what the book is largely based on, although the activities of business people in the 1600s, 1700s, late 1600s, and summaries or an overview of the pre-colonial era.
Just to summarize, in a way, one of the reasons for the book is you wanted to show that the economic imbalances we see now are man-made.
Correct. If we see the activities of Black people, whether you look at mining, people were mining in Kimberley. It was a non-racial arrangement during the diamond boom of the 1860s.
In Kimberley, yes. That was a fascinating section of the book. Tell us a little bit more about it, because, it seemed like it was a very unstable environment. Blacks and whites were all there trying to get diamonds. And the white diamond diggers really wanted to get the blacks out. And at first, the British governor was sympathetic to the Black diamond diggers, but in the end, he succumbed to pressure from the whites.
Correct. So everybody flocks to Kimberley, what was then called New Rush,
Yeah.
People from Australia, people from England, people from America, shovel in hand, ship ticket, on the palm, and they land in the Cape and they take wagons, of course. Their faces are bronzed, they get to Kimberley. And it's a beehive of activity. Everybody is searching for diamonds. Now I ask myself, but what could have been the natives of South Africa been doing when everybody came offshore searching for these precious stones? And you discover in the archive, John, that actually mining activity did take place non-racially, non-sexually so. Third diamond, there are the two famous diamonds that were found and marketed internationally. The third diamond was found by a native on the banks of the Vaal River in 1867. Before the peak of winter in 1870, a Khoi man, had sold a stone for about 140 pounds, but he acquired agricultural material for that diamond. In September 1870, John, a Korana woman, the Korana are part of the Khoi, had sold a 61-carat stone, imagine, in the Free State. And that stone was later valued at about 8,000 pounds. Of course, as non-racial as it was, there were also market dynamics, which are prevalent globally. In business, the small player always finds it difficult to operate when there's a big player. As much as there were non-racial issues, there were also complex racial and non-racial issues. For example, the small diggers, non-racially so, worked together. That is, black and white diamond claim owners worked together as small people against the large monopoly, which was largely based, which was largely of a foreign nature.
Right.
And people like Saudi wanted to protect such people. And as you indicate, there was a big march on the market square in Kimberley. That unity among individual diggers that was non-racial based was torn apart. Racism won, and large foreign mining won.
I want to move on to a lot of other subjects, but just before we leave diamond mining,
Yeah.
One of the interesting things was the way they forced black South Africans out of the business was to sort of brand diamonds that black people had as theft, when in fact there was theft in all sorts of places. There were white dealers, all sorts of people, but they branded black dealers as stealing, and that was one way that you started this whole notion of illicit diamonds.
Correct. And you read the book, John.
Yeah.
There's a missionary that was based in Kimberley, whom I quote in the book. His name is Reverend Gwai Kyamzashe. And he narrates the 1870s period. He says in Kimberley, at the mining works, you couldn't distinguish between a black and white man because everybody was covered in suit, right? Not the suit that people wear today for the benefit of a younger viewer, but right. The suit as in, dust, and people worked together. So people mined together non-racially so, and people stole together non-racially so. There were white diamond stealers and there were black diamond stealers, right? But sadly, the theft took on a racial posture. And I'll tell you why the theft took a racial posture, why the illicit diamond buying ordinances were targeted at black people. One, you needed labor. Some people felt that, if you allow Black people to mine in a non-racial manner, where is the labor going to come from?
Right.
And the labor issue, of course, matters to large foreign capital funded mining operators. They were operating claims on a large scale and needed labor. So best way is to use the rules of theft and say these people steal, they should be subjected to laboring so that they can meet the demand. But they soon had a problem with that, John, too, because labor became expensive in Kimberley, in the early days. People who were native or Black, who mined there as laborers, went there, they mined for a month, and they went back home to Natal or Limpopo, and they bought huge farms. So that also became a problem until, the Mineral Energy Complex way back then decided that they were going to cut down, labor costs so that people were dependent on their jobs. So correct, your characterization is very correct.
We're going to take a break in a moment, but I want to just round off on the 19th century. I mean, in that period, there were business. Well, no, let's go back a little. I'm just going to fill in a few things before we go to the break. In pre-colonial times in the Cape, there were Black South African traders. Before the colonialists. Then in the 1800s, there were traders, there were furniture manufacturers, there were people in the transport business, and there were even Black South Africans who owned hotels and small chains of trading stores. This is all in your book. I'm not going to let you respond to it now because we're going to have to take a break. But when we come back, I want to ask you about that period because it seems to me that leading up to Union in 1910, there were some opportunities, and that's when the doors really closed. But we'll be right back with Phakamisa and Ndzamel in a moment. And we're back talking to Phakamisa Ndzamel about his book, Native Merchants, the Building of the Black Business Class in South Africa. Phakamisa, I mean, this is a fascinating period. I researched some of these things on, especially the Black media, for my first book. It seemed that there was a period where there was a real flowering of Black media. And leading up to 1909. And there was also an overlap between the Black politicians and Black business people and Black South Africans who had newspapers as well. And how did that mix work? And it was those people who went to London several times, 1909, later again, and then, of course, 1919, to try and plead their cause.
Sure, John, you are so correct. Before the Union of 1910, there was still some semblance of a non-racial cooperation.
Yes.
In business. So let's take the story of, you mentioned newspapers.
Yes.
Let's take the story of Jabavu and Company of King Williamstown.
Right.
Now, John Tengo Jabavu started his own newspaper enterprise called Imvo Zabantsundu, or Black Opinion, in 1884. He received financial backing from James Wilson Ware and the lawyer Richard Rose Innes, in addition to his own resources.
Well, they were also political. Sorry if I can interrupt you. They were also political allies because Jabavu had the vote at that time.
Correct. Because in the Cape there was a colorblind constitution that allowed people within a certain level of income
Yeah.
to earn
To vote.
property, to be able to vote. So Jabavu was part of that crew, but within that limited liberal framework, Black people had to vote for a white representative
Right.
to represent them in parliament. And so Rose Innes, you are correct, would have been an ally of Jabavu in that context.
Right. Yeah, and then I mean the so there was that period of flowering of business, or to some extent, and media particularly. But of course, the 1913 Land Act, this is after Union, of course, did huge damage, and it wasn't the only legislation that really cut off one avenue after another to Black business advancement.
Correct, John. But if you may allow me, I also wanted to expand more on that Jabavu period before we get into 1913 and before the Union. So capital, yes, was raised in a non-racial format where there was limited pools of capital amongst natives. They would go to their European friends and they would raise capital. And this was not free money, John. On March 14, 1899, Jabavu and John Knox Bokwe, through the entity Jabavu and Bokwe, raised a bond of up to £500, from the Kafrarian Steam Printing Company of King Williamstown. Now, this is how credit worked back in the day. It was not just banks that gave money. So you had a store card equivalent. So John and company would give Phakamisa credit, but on the basis that Phakamisa would buy goods from John. Right. So in this instance, the steam printing company where Jabavu and Bokwe had raised £500 from, they needed their printing abilities. Of course, later Jabavu would expand and build his own platform as Jabavu and company. Bokwe left and Jabavu worked hard. He had interests actually in Sol Plaatji's Tsala Yabe Tswana. 1910, for close to a year, Jabavu and company was printing Tsala Yabe Tswana from King Williamstown. And, it was transported, 600 kilometers, to Plaatji's offices in Kimberley. You could look at the story of Iniwe, the hotelier that you referred to before the break. Iniwe had also raised money from the Ware, James Wilson Ware family. Iniwe did something that was never ever imagined, in the Cape. He built a hotel in 1894, a £2,000 hotel at the marketplace of King Williamstown. And that hotel was fit to be occupied by any human of any race. Now, Iniwe, was born of Christian parents in 1857, if I recall well. And it's a rags to riches story. He had to work for his mother to pay for school fees and for his clothing. But at the age of 15, Iniwe leaves school and he enters the postal services or the telegraph department as linesman, back then, and he works, but, he had worked, education was quite good at the time. If you left in standard 5, you would have known the 3 R's. reading, writing, and arithmetic. So he worked his way out. He became a teacher and was so frugal that he was able to start retail and lodging businesses until he built the 2,000 pound hotel. And there were many others that are in the book, the Nembulas, who were sugar merchants and at some point exported their sugar, to the Paris show in France before the 1900s. Now, of course, you had people like Stephen Sonji, before we get to 1913, a commercial farmer, in the late 1800s, who did farming so well, who had moved from being a civil servant to a commercial farmer. You had farmers in Alice. I quote a lot of Colin Bundy there, around the agricultural merchant activities of Black people in the Cape. Now, what then happens is that, the 1913 was such a disaster because it destroyed all that work, especially in farming. People, the rate of native agricultural farming would have certainly been affected by the limited use of land.
Phakamisa, we're going to run out of time any minute. Before we do, I just wanted to sort of come into the 20th century, and then I'm going to finish with a question about where we are currently. Just in the 20th century, over the period after 1913, Black business really declined terribly as a result of the laws. And then you also tell the story, and we don't have time to go into it fully now, but it's worthwhile for the viewer to go and take a look at, of someone like Walter Sisulu, who was in politics, but also had an estate agency. And he had to battle through restriction after restriction to be able to run his estate agency.
Correct. Before he was an active politician, Walter Sisulu, he had worked as a mine worker, but then transformed himself and he started an estate agency business, And despite the difficulties of the time, Sisulu built an estate agency business selling property in Johannesburg. But, as apartheid started to peak, Sisulu also divested his time from business and started focusing on politics. You'll remember in 1949, that's when he's elected as Secretary General of the ANC. Now, you can't do both, right. John. You can't be an active politician and a businessman.
Phakamisa, sorry, I need to interrupt you because we're going to run out of time almost immediately. I want to ask you about something that's come up on this show is this whole question of incentives. What incentives does government create today? There are incentives through BEE to create Black shareholding, but they're not the same level of incentives to create jobs. Is that not one area one might explore? I'm afraid we've got 40 seconds.
Sure. There's got to be a balance. The narrative in South Africa is that if you invest in businesses, you create the necessary environment for business to work, those businesses grow and they create jobs. It is true, but that narrative is often exaggerated. Perhaps the poster should be to invest not in minority equity stakes where a Black-owned company buys 10%, but invest in operations where Black-owned companies, are scaled up and they run huge operations that can employ people. A 10% stake in an established company, of course, has a limited ability to create jobs. But yeah.
I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Phakamisa, thank you so much for talking to us. The book is Native Merchants, The Building of the Black Business Class in South Africa. After the break, we're going to talk about Afrikaner business with Ebba Dommerson. We'll be right back. And we're back. We're now talking to Ebba Dommerson, a retired journalist and editor who's been writing books in his retirement. And this one is, in a way, the most ambitious yet. It's called Fortunes, The Rise and Rise of Afrikaner Tycoons. Ebba, welcome.
Thank you very much.
It's interesting that you argue in your book that the richest man in history was an African in Mali, in Timbuktu.
That's correct, yes. Mansa Musa. He was an emperor of Mali and Ghana and so on at that time, very rich, because he had gold and salt.
And in modern terms, if you account for inflation, he's richer than Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk?
He's richer than the Rothschilds together, yes. And he did a lot with his money. Timbuktu he started the university there, and he was all over with trade in Africa, in northern Africa. So it's an old history, really.
Fascinating. Now, this book is about an interesting phenomenon which is often discussed, but not often understood, and that's the rise of Afrikaner business in the time of democracy. Let's just address this idea of a Stellenbosch mafia. I think you just say that the term was coined by David Shapiro, who's a Johannesburg financial advisor, and he meant it as a sort of joke. And in Johannesburg, I know they talk about mafias. It doesn't have any special meaning.
Well, it's been used politically, but in business, it really is a joke. It's a myth that they act as a mafia, and so on. And I treated it as it was a joke that got out of hand, really. And
yes.
There's little truth in it.
But what is really interesting to me about the modern Stellenbosch entrepreneurs is that they have found new niches. PSG, for example, they discovered that there was a nation of people who were unbanked, the poor, black, white, who couldn't afford normal banks, the traditional banks. And Capitec arose that way, and it's turned out to be a brilliant success. And that's only one of the ideas they've come up that have found a new niche and really exploited it brilliantly.
Oh, yes. Michiel Leroux really gets all the credit for that with Gerry Fourie, the present boss of Capitec. But it was really unthinkable that the poor could be banked like that. Capitec is now, as far as I know, the bank with the biggest client bases in South Africa. And
I believe that's correct.
Very, very successful. Yes.
Yes. Now, just to sort of get Afrikaner business into context, if you go into the 20th century, there's also an oversimplification. I've written a lot about the Broederbond, but in fact, the first real successes, Eskom and ISCOR, were really started by some brilliant people, but in the time of Smuts and Herzog, before the nationalist government.
Yes, and the interesting thing was that, you hear a lot about nationalization today, but this was not nationalization.
No.
This was the state starting up huge companies, ISCOR and so, and the people like Van der Bijl and Van Eck and those
yes.
people in the 20s. They were the founders and the idea men about this.
Yes. Now, one area where I think I'm probably going to differ with you ascribe little role to government in assisting Afrikaner business. But my sense is, for instance, Volkskas was an Afrikaans bank, but it got a lot of government business. So that was obviously enormously helpful.
Yes, I should agree with that. The real point that I'm making is white business was assisted by the government in general. And Afrikaners, to some degree, and we know about concessions that some Afrikaners got in fishing, in diamonds and so on, but not in a big way as the whole of white business. The whole of white business was assisted during apartheid and before, yes.
Okay, now to the heart of your book, which is post-1994. We talked about Capitec, which was extraordinary, and the others in that group. They discovered that that people were dissatisfied with the education system, so they started private schools. Now that's the Curro group, and then they started universities. So those have been substantial businesses that have just been new niches.
That's correct, and also, you know, supplanting what the state was doing. I mean, the whole thrust of the present government is that the state should take the lead in the economy, which I think is too ambitious for the state. The state has severe capacity problems. You hear about it all the time. And people talk about economic freedom, but they don't like the free market. There's a disconsonance there.
Yes. I mean, I suppose that companies like Rembrandt under Anton Rupert and Sanlam, that was really more community cooperative promotion of business for Afrikaners.
Yeah, that was mobilization of Afrikaner capital. That was what's happening there. And it's been extensively written about by Grietje Verhoef and other people.
But now the perhaps most extraordinary success has been Koos Bekker at Naspers.
Yes.
Naspers was started in 1915, was the owner of Die Burger, which was a National Party official paper. And Koos Bekker came in, of course he did Mnet, and then he found this Chinese investment, which has just taken the company into the stratosphere.
Yes, Tencent, yeah.
Yeah.
And after many failures in China, I mean, I write about it in the book, and Koos decided that, you know, you can't go on with Western managers in China, you need the Chinese. And you can assist them, and I think that was the correct...
that was the breakthrough, that was, Western investors, and he at first was the same, we're bringing in Western managers.
Yes.
And that was a failure.
Yeah.
And then when he
tremendous failure, you know, Naspers shares went down from 100 Rand to 12 Rand.
And that was on the failed Chinese investments.
Among others. There were many others, yeah.
Yes. And his investment in Tencent was $30 million, and it's now worth tens of billions of dollars.
Yes, but sliding at the moment.
But sliding at the moment.
China is having extending a heavy hand on the tech industry in China, as we all know.
Right. And, and of course the one disaster was Steinhoff, Marcus Jooste, who built up this massive conglomerate, went global, was buying businesses in America and in Europe, and became second biggest furniture company in Europe, and it all ended in tears.
Well, there was certainly, dirty things happening at the crossroads. I mean, Marcus Jooste was really a genius in working the system and taxation. He's a taxation expert. And to use that knowledge, and as you all know, you can use knowledge in a very bad way. And there was certainly, in Steinhoff, there were, dirty dealings, that's for sure.
Yes, and I suppose everybody asks the same question they ask about politicians. There haven't been consequences.
So far, yes. The Dutch are onto the case, and the Germans. And over here, the problem is, does the Valois and the prosecutors...
The National Prosecuting Authority.
Do they have the expertise to take on Steinhoff, because it is a huge deal. This one professor from UCT said it would take years to unravel.
And is your sense that the Dutch and German authorities will eventually bring some prosecutions?
I think so. They're very slow. You know, they started this a few years ago already, and there was the article in that German magazine which triggered off everything. So far, not much happening.
Yes. And do you know what the South Africans are doing?
Yes, they're busy, but they depend on the PricewaterhouseCoopers summary of what was happening, and that is still part of it is still secret, of course.
Yes. And there's still a question mark about whether auditors are really getting to the heart of these things. I mean, these cases, they had auditors, they had internal auditors and external auditors, and yet they didn't pick it up for a very long time.
Yes, the auditors didn't come out very well out of this whole mess. It is really a scandal, and they couldn't. Well, maybe they did pick it up. Some did.
And didn't act?
They were suspicious. I mean, they told Christo Wiese, he was chairman at the time, he told there's something very wrong here. And he found it very difficult to believe. And I mean, he's a top businessman. He couldn't detect it.
Right. Yeah, it's an interesting question. Why the auditors haven't been able to get to the bottom of it. But we're going to take a break. When we come back, I'm going to ask you about Afrikaner business and black business. We'll take a break and we'll be right back with Iba Domisa. And we're back talking to Iba Domisa. His latest book is Fortunes, The Rise and Rise of Afrikaner Tycoons. Iba, there is a distinction I think you make, that people like Johan Rupert and some of the other Afrikaner business people are more keen to keep their money in South Africa than some of the traditional white business people.
Yes, I think there is an attachment to the land and to the country, and Afrikaners do have long roots in South Africa, going way back, and they struggled in business for many years. And after the Anglo-Boer War, of course, there was desperation really, and huge poverty among whites generally, but especially among Afrikaners, because they came from the countryside mostly. So the farm is a big thing among English, I would say, in South Africa. And we're moving away from a farming community. We're going into the age of the mega farmers, huge farms, very successful and using the very latest modern technology, and they're doing very, very well. But the numbers of farmers are declining. The small farms really do have a lot of trouble ahead, except if they're close to the cities where they can find niche markets.
Right.
Yeah. But yes, I think in general the Afrikaner businessman would like to invest in South Africa, but the government unfortunately is making it very difficult. The regulations, Whitey Besson talking about if you want to export thousands and thousands and reams of papers that you have to fill in. It's the market they should let the market go and make it easy for business. I see the new Minister of Finance is talking about that.
Yes.
That's the way to keep the top businessmen here. We're losing talent. We're losing lots of our millionaires are going out of the country, and it's really devastating.
I also see you refer to 2,500 South African farmers who've moved to farm in other parts of Africa.
That's and to Georgia, for instance, all over the place now, and doing fairly well. And they should do better here. They should. But if you look at the state of the ports for export, you look at the railway system, you look at the delivery system in South Africa, it's very, very difficult.
You also you made really just a casual reference to this, but it's something that's always interested me. I think it's there are technical schools being built that that teach in the Afrikaans language. So they'll take anyone in Afrikaans, which means whites and colours predominantly, learning to be plumbers and wood and carpenters and builders and all of those things. At the same time, the government has closed down a lot of the technical training.
Yes.
So that means that the next generation of South Africans doing all those jobs, which are often well-paying, will be Afrikaans speakers.
You're basically mostly referring to Soltech. They don't take that many, you know. They have capacity problems as well. Yeah, yeah. But I think it's essential that the education moves in this way toward more technical now. You know, you take a plumber. If you get a plumber, you pay through your neck, and they do very well. So there seems to be still a feeling about educated people that these jobs are below them and so on. It's absolute nonsense. In Australia and so on, these people are well paid and they live next to the richest people in those countries. There shouldn't be it shouldn't be shameful to do these technical jobs, and there's lots of space for, you know, in our education system. I think it's really broken. It should develop much better than it does.
In your book, you write about the relationship between Sanlam and Patrice Motsepe. He was a budding black entrepreneur, but a very talented business person. Can you explain that relationship and how it worked?
Yes. Patrice Motsepe was actually encouraged by Nelson Mandela to join Sanlam because the general feeling at that time, even in the top ANC circles, was that, you know, the English people was going out of the country, English business was moving to London and so on, while the Afrikaners were staying, and he encouraged Motsepe to join Sanlam. Motsepe became vice chair of Sanlam. And he started his own business, African Rainbow. And he joined up with Johan van Zyl, who was the CEO of Sanlam at that time. They're still together. And as you can see, every now and then, new startups expanding and so on. So there is a relationship there. And there are some others, but not very big so far. But I think, you know, it really shows working together is the way to the future.
So that means black economic empowerment is not such a bad idea?
I think the way it's being implemented is not very helpful, you know, because it goes mostly with political connections. And then then the corruption starts, and that is endemic now, and so on. And more government control, and I write in the book that increases the risk that every point of control becomes a point of corruption.
Yes, well, as you said, I mean, the finance minister seems to be saying some very good things. I think the trouble is that the public is tired of statements without implementation.
Oh, sure, especially on the local level.
Yes. Johan Rupert has become something of a sort of a lightning rod, at least for the economic freedom fighters. How do you see his role?
Well, he is a lightning rod, all right, but he's not afraid to speak his mind. You know, he does so, and he's got very valuable international contacts. He could mean a lot for the country, and really carrying on about white monopoly capital and so on. It's very funny. It's coming from the government, which has its own monopolies, and some are flops, to say the least. Eskom, Transnet, look at the railway system. They have monopolies. And it's a mess. So attacking Johan Rupert is not very helpful for the future of South Africa.
Yes, but I have a concern about monopolies, if they're real monopolies.
Yes.
But I'm not sure that Johan Rupert has any monopolies at the moment.
Well, he said he's been trying to get one for his whole life, and he hasn't succeeded.
Yes. Because there isn't a business. I mean, in the apartheid era, the Anglo-American had a monopoly in many areas.
De Beers.
Diamonds was a global monopoly.
Sure.
In fact, Anglo went into so many other fields, but now that's no longer the case. And I'm not sure that we've benefited from the fact that Anglo is a much smaller beast in South Africa.
Yes. And not a monopoly at all anymore.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what would you like to see? What would you like to see that would make the kind of future business? I mean, really, because what we care about in the public is job creation.
Yes. Oh, yes. That basically it means that business has to play a much stronger role. A small business creates jobs. And that's all over the world. It happened in China as well. Once they went for the free market, they gained prosperity. And over here, I think there's a whole wrong idea about China. They don't really allow trade unions. There's one federation, and it's controlled by the Communist Party. Here, the trade unions think that China is a wonderful model for us. But in the East, there's a culture of shame. These party cadres, if they transgress, they're fired. Over here, they're not promoted to become chairman of parliamentary committees and things like that.
Yes. I've looked at development economies like China and Japan particularly, which is perhaps a better example for us because it's a little bit more similar. China is a one-party state without a democracy. Mm-hmm. But the one thing that the Japanese learned was when government was too powerful in its interaction with business, it failed.
Yes.
But conversely, when business was too powerful in relation to government, it also failed.
Yes.
Because business has a short-term interest, whereas government, if it's too powerful, becomes utopian. And really, Japan's real success after World War II was when the relationship was roughly equal.
Yes.
And the government still plays an enormous role in Japan, enormous role.
Yes, with the MITI.
With MITI, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry. But their policies have to be market conforming. Mm. And so they say, we want you to do things you may not want to do. But they've got to be things that make sense in the market.
It's the same in Singapore. Singapore is also a much better model for South Africa than China.
Yes.
The big thing about China is it's not a democracy. There is no freedom in China.
Right.
And you're being watched all the time on cameras. And, it's a police state, really. Yeah. And I don't think we want that.
Yeah. Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. I'm not sure we've solved the problem of job creation in South Africa. It's a problem that has to be solved, and it's going to have to be solved by a combination of government and business. Phakamisa, thanks for joining us. The book is Fortunes, The Rise and Rise of Afrikaner Tycoons. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on The Forum. I'm John Matheson.